Hi everyone, Peter here from Flow High Performance, and in this presentation we're going to be covering the topic of injury prevention for team sports. And we're going to be going through a hierarchy of importance of what factors are the most important and are going to have the highest impact on reducing injury risk in team sports, and then what factors may have less of an impact in reducing injury risk. So this is a pyramid that was taken from a 2018 study and basically outlines a hierarchy of importance of factors that are going to influence injury risk in team sports. So what's important to note is that the factors at the bottom are going to form the base of our injury prevention program, whereas the factors at the top are going to have less of an effect and therefore shouldn't be considered as highly as these factors at the bottom. Throughout the rest of this presentation, we're going to be going through each factor and explaining how they will affect injury risk in team sports. So the first factor and the most important factor is going to be our player recruitment or our list management. So essentially what this is referring to is the players that we have in our team. The reality is that some players are simply predisposed to a high risk of injury based on non-modifiable factors. Certain factors like past injury, anatomy, even the sex of the athlete and the age of the athlete can all have quite a significant impact on injury risk regardless of the interventions they do. So for example, we know that for many injuries such as hamstring strains or ACL ruptures, that if it's been done in the past, the risk of doing it again is much higher. Furthermore, certain anatomical features lend themselves greater or worse to injury risk for different movements. For certain injuries, males or females have different risks, and in general, older athletes will generally have a higher risk of injury in most cases. So in this meta-analysis from 2015, they looked at risk factors that are associated with recurrent shoulder instability after having an initial shoulder dislocation. So they're looking at basically all these people that had shoulder dislocations, what factors were likely to make them have chronic recurrent shoulder instability. So basically they found that people that were younger than 40 had a 13 times greater chance of recurrent shoulder instability. So in this case, the younger age was actually associated with an increased risk. Men were also 3 times more likely to have shoulder instability after their injury than females. An interesting one here is that during their shoulder dislocation, if there was a fracture on the greater tuberosity, so a part of the humerus, they were actually 7 times less likely to suffer from recurrent shoulder instability. And then the last one was if they had hyperlaxity in their shoulder, they had a 3 times more likely chance of recurrent shoulder instability. So these factors here are all non-modifiable. They've already been done and they can't be changed. However, they have quite significant impacts on the risk of injury. So if we have someone who is less than 40, a male that didn't have a fracture during the shoulder dislocation and have a hyperlax shoulder, we probably don't want them to play sports that require throwing or being in positions that require throwing or lots of shoulder stability. And simply managing these players to either recruit the ones that are less at risk of injury or somehow managing the players to put them in certain positions or roles that are not going to put them at higher risk of injury is the biggest factor we actually have in influencing injury risk in team sport. So the next factor that has a major impact on injury risk and is also completely controllable by the management is load monitoring and management of that training load. So essentially, all athletes have a maximum level of load they can tolerate before they start to break down. So no matter how elite an athlete is, if you push them to a certain point, they will break down and they will get injured no matter who they are. So the first point is that we don't want to push athletes to this maximum level. And that breaking point is going to be different for different groups of athletes and different individuals. There are also other strategies we can use to manipulate training load in order to reduce injury risk. The first point is that high chronic workloads may have a preventative mechanism against injury. So if we have a look at this study from 2016, on this graph here, we can see the chronic workload in arbitrary units going from low to high. And on this axis here, the risk of injury as a percentage per number of exposures to that sport. So as we can see here, if we have a very low chronic workload, so if we're doing very little training over a month period, we're probably going to have quite a low risk of injury. simply because we're not exposing ourselves to enough opportunities to get injured, which makes sense. However, as we have a low to moderate workload throughout the previous month, our risk of injury increases. However, as we increase training load up to high and moderate high levels, we seem to have a reduced risk of injury. And this is proposed to be that because we have a high workload throughout the training month, when we have intense bouts of games or intense training sessions, our body is able to tolerate those demands because we are physically prepared for them by having high chronic workloads. So for example, if our athletes are used to having high workloads throughout the month, and then we have competitive matches, the competitive match is not going to be much of an impact on these athletes because they're so in shape and prepared for those demands. Whereas if our athletes have a low chronic workload or a moderate chronic workload, and then we have a competitive match, that's going to be a big stimulus and quite a big stress on their bodies, and therefore we may not be quite prepared and have a higher risk of getting injured. So we need to make sure that our athletes have a high chronic workload over the season in order to make sure we have a high baseline fitness level. The other take-home point from this study was looking at the acute to chronic workload ratio. So this ratio is essentially referring to the ratio of the workload we do in 7 days versus the workload we did in the past 28 days. So how much workload we're doing this week in comparison to the workload we've done in the previous month. So a low acute chronic workload ratio would mean that we have a gradual increase in load, whereas a high chronic workload will mean that we have a very high spike in load this week in comparison to the past. And it's pretty clear from this graph that we see a general trend that the higher the acute to chronic workload ratio, the higher the risk of injury. So essentially the take-home message here is that we want to avoid acute spikes in load and rather have gradual progressions in load. Next in the hierarchy, we have athletic development. And essentially what we're referring to with athletic development is strength and conditioning training. So simply put, athletes who are not strong or fit enough are more likely to break down during hard training and competition. This meta-analysis from 2014 compiled a whole bunch of injury prevention training strategies and categorized them into stretching, strength training, proprioception training, and then a combination of either of these training methods. And what we can see is that stretching had almost no impact on injury rate, while strength training was able to reduce the injury rate by almost 70% in comparison to control groups who did no strength training. We can also see that proprioception training had quite a significant impact on injury rate, reducing injuries by up to 50%. And a combination of some of these training methods also had a fairly significant effect. So in our athletic development programs, it's probably going to be important to include some strength training and some proprioception training. Some reasons that strength and conditioning training can reduce injury risk are from tissue conditioning, so actually strengthening the resilience of the tissue, making them less susceptible to stress from the sport, providing a variation in loading in comparison to the monotonous sport training. This is going to break that up and give some variation to adapt to. And then lastly, also some carryover to improve coordination and technique. So strength training and proprioception training may allow us to run, cut, change direction, jump, land more efficiently, and therefore reduce the injury risk from those sort of activities. Although it doesn't really matter why it works, the point is that it does reduce injury risk, and therefore it's probably important to include in our athletic development program, assuming it's done well. The next factor that is going to help reduce injury risk is improving our movement efficiency. So if we are moving efficient, we have less stress on unwanted tissues, and we have more stress on the tissues that we want to load. This point ties in with the previous section on strength and conditioning training. As we saw, proprioception training had a significant impact on reducing injury risk, and improvement movement efficiency is interrelated with proprioception training and even strength training. Nonetheless, in our sport performance program, we probably want to implement some specific exercises to improve movement efficiency. So this study from 2010 basically looked at athletes who had suffered an anterior cruciate ligament injury and have had to have an ACL reconstruction. And essentially what they looked at is, from a landing task, could any particular factors predict the risk of future injury? So basically what they did is a landing from different heights, and they had a look at a few biomechanical measures. And then these athletes went on to play their sport, and those who suffered a secondary ACL rupture were compared between those who didn't. And what they found is that during the landing task, the athletes who had a significant knee valgus during their landing were more likely to go on and suffer a secondary ACL injury. And this is probably because when we're landing in this sort of position, the anterior cruciate ligament is going to take a lot of the stress, and if that stress is too much to handle, it can be injured, as opposed to moving efficiently and actually loading the muscles eccentrically when we land. So that's one example of landing, but other movements like running, cutting, jumping, landing, as we mentioned, even kicking and throwing, if we can become more efficient at these movements, we are again going to place less stress on the tissues we don't want to stress and more stress on the tissues that can handle it, which is usually the muscles. Another training intervention that can help reduce injury rates is specific injury prevention programs. The most important thing with these programs is that they're done consistently throughout the season. Otherwise, they will likely not have a very significant effect on reducing injury rate. This study in 2015 looked at the use of the FIFA 11 Plus injury prevention program for college soccer teams over a number of seasons. And so what we can see here is that the teams that implemented their FIFA 11 Plus injury prevention program had around a 46% reduction in injury rate compared to the teams that didn't implement this program during their season. So this is a significant result. We can see that injury rates were reduced by almost half. However, when we actually look at the FIFA 11 Plus injury prevention program, it includes exercises such as the Nordic hamstring curl, jumping and landing, core strength and stability, and proprioception training. So many of these exercises will already be covered in a comprehensive athletic development training program, and if we include specific movement efficiency training. So yes, these specific injury prevention programs can reduce injury rates, but if our strength and conditioning program is appropriate, we probably will already cover most of those bases with those programs. So whether these injury prevention exercises are included in a separate program or within the athletic development program, it probably doesn't matter too much as long as they are done in some capacity and are performed consistently throughout the season. The last training intervention that can help us reduce injury risk in team sports is the injury assessment and rehabilitation. So this naturally sits towards the lower end of the priorities simply due to the fact that an injury has already occurred. However, the assessment and rehabilitation process can impact the risk of a future injury occurring. So if we do this part well, we may be able to reduce the risk of that injury happening again. So basically the decision as to when an athlete can return to their sport may influence their injury reoccurrence or the lack of injury reoccurrence if we do it well. Factors such as physical fitness, psychological preparedness after their injury, the current pain and symptoms of their injury, and how important the competition is coming up may all influence whether or not we decide to let the athlete return to sport. So this study from 2015 outlined a framework on how we can decide on when the athlete is ready to return to their sport. So basically these three factors, the assessment of the injury, the assessment of the activity risk, and then the assessment of the risk tolerance, should all be taken into consideration when deciding on this return to play decision. So basically what we're looking for is in the assessment of injury, what causes pain, what causes symptoms, what is the healing process, basically the whole medical side to the injury. Then we need to have a look at the sport or the position they play in the sport and what movements they're going to be doing and what activities they're going to be performing. And to what extent are these activities going to aggravate the injury? So essentially, how severe is the injury and what is going to irritate it? And does the sport or the position in the sport interrupt the healing process? And the last factor to this framework is the risk tolerance. So how well can the athlete tolerate their injury while playing their sport? So can we mask this injury up somehow? Can we tape it up? Can we implement some sort of placebo mechanism to reduce symptoms? Can we modify how they play? And how important is the competition coming up? Can they simply just play through the injury? All this needs to be weighed up before we make our decision as to whether the athlete can return to play. If we make a poor decision and the athlete returns to play, they may have a reoccurrence of that injury or injure something else because they're physically not prepared. However, if we give enough time and we make sure their fitness and their psychological preparedness is up to par, we may be able to prevent any reoccurrence of that injury. And the last factor that's going to influence injury risk is luck. We should never hope an athlete or a group of athletes don't get injured, but luck always plays a small part in the process. So we may implement all the previous factors well and still have some injury occurrences. Other athletes may do nothing and not get an injury. If we have a look at this injury risk spectrum, on this extreme we have completely preventable injuries, and on this extreme we have injuries that are not preventable at all. Now, in reality, almost no injuries are completely preventable and no injuries are not at all preventable. Almost all injuries lie somewhere in the middle here, in that we can have an influence, they are somewhat preventable, but there's still a chance of them happening. So no matter what we do, it's almost inevitable that some injuries are likely to occur. And that is simply the nature of high performance sport. However, we can reduce the likelihood of this happening by implementing the strategies that we have just discussed. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already.